I really love this. This is great. Uh, how many beans? Do we know how many beans is?
250,000.
250,000 beans. Right. Beautiful. Um, I think this is kind of an example of what we love to do at our organization. So our mission for Herb Arts is to create platforms and the platform creatives for youth and community development. The big idea behind platforming creatives or adult artists is simply this. St. Louis has been significantly losing population since about the 1950s. We are a fraction of what we once were. That has tremendous economic consequences in terms of tax base and distribution of resources. And so that means that if you don't have a stable economy for artists, then artists cannot possibly thrive. And we see some of that happening in the schools, less and less focus on art, more and more focus on STEM, and that's great, but we do know that scientists are creative. We do know that scientists have to use their imaginative capacities to be able to come up with great solutions for today's problems. We do know that, right? And it's always been the case. Now, sometimes we like to somehow delineate between the artist and the creative, but as Sam already noted, we're all creative. And we might be scientific, we might be nerdy, we might be all about whatever, but we'll still have that artistic side to us. That should never be compartmentalized. It should be a part of who we are, incomplete, in total. So that was like a nerd, who's like, look, I know all the bean count here, you know? But there was also a designer who understood the subtle gradations between some of the lighter beans and some of the darker textures, and to be able to put these things together in a way that shows us as St. Louis from the east side, right? So if we would be standing in East St. Louis looking at St. Louis, the gateway to the west, and all of what that means. So somebody had to have this perspective. Somebody had to do this kind of work. So anyways, I just saw this and it made me think about kind of the larger thing that we do here. And because that artists have the space and hopefully the commission to be able to do the work, we have this beautiful work of art that we can admire right now. But how many artists are commissioned to do their work? How many of them are supported? And then as a result, how many of them have the pleasure of being able to stay in the city where they want to do this work, right? So we look at the full and complete ecosystem. All right, so I think this thing works for me. Yes. Oh, the image went away. Oh, the images. It's all good. So what you would have seen is an image of 6 kids. They went to Las Vegas, Nevada, not to gamble, but to participate in the International Youth Poetry Slam competition. Many of them have started this journey of getting to know who they are, in terms of their sexuality, in terms of their gender. All of them needed a safe space to kind of express themselves. And these were kids from all throughout the greater St. Louis area. So some living in St. Louis City, others living in Collinsville, Illinois, still others in Jefferson County, Baldwin, so West St. Louis County area. But they all came together and they were able to compete and they had a great experience and they happened to have won this International Youth Poetry Slam competition to kind of fly a banner for St. Louis. And that's great. And maybe you'll get a chance to see it, but what's more important is the stories that they got a chance to tell. They got a chance to talk about who they were. And they got a chance to benefit from the advice and coaching from some fantastic St. Louis poets. Oh, there they are. A little dark. Cool. But it's cool. That's us. That's me. So you kind of see them in the background. And it is such an interesting picture. This is the picture that we've been using whenever we kind of promote who they are and what they're about in the community. And so 2 of them are Youth Poets Laureate. So that would be Cameron and that's Zach. And then we have a person from Cedar Hill. And what's interesting about my guy back here, Caleb. Caleb is someone who, when we first met Caleb, he was not rocking makeup, right? He did not have like this kind of glamorous sort of look that he has right now. And right now he's still using the pronoun he, him. But he belongs to a household where some of who he is not accepted. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until this picture was publicized where he began to have a conversation at home to explain the makeup. And he finally had a conversation with his mom where he came out. So how do we create safe spaces? Well, part of how we create safe spaces is by making sure that creatives have space just to be themselves. And this goes on. There are several members on this team, all teenagers, who had to find a safe space for their self-expression. And organizationally, we provide that, but it's so important because after they exit our space, they still got to go into their homes. They still have to go into their schools. They still have to go into their communities. And whatever safety they might feel may not be there for them. So how do we ensure that they receive the kind of justice necessary, right? How do we make sure that their treatment is fair, not unlike anyone else in the room, regardless of how whether or not they conform to the gender binary or whatever the case may be, but they are treated fairly, they're treated with love. Well, that's the thing about justice. So justice could mean that. It could mean how we administer rewards and punishments based on law. It could mean that. But the justice that Sam mentioned, this social justice, sometimes isn't about equity at all. Sometimes it is about inequity. Sometimes. And part of how we think about inequity in terms of justice is if you do something that is great and it happens to be greater than someone else, then you should get a lion's share of the reward. If we're strictly talking about equity, then that means that how we might distribute these rewards would be the same regardless of whatever you bring to the table. But we know that as a part of the American experience, competition has disrupted all of that. The idea of the marketplace has disrupted all of that. Capitalism has disrupted all of that. But one of the things that we found over time is that regardless of the marketplace and capitalism and things of that nature, there's some people who've been denied their fair share of what they've earned, partly because of what they look like, what they believe, and who they are. So they might have won the lion's share through their art, through their self-expression, but because of how they look, because of where they come from, they may be denied that. How do you repair decades of denial of resources that are supposedly for you? How do you do that? Well, I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Quick overview. So we'll talk about justice. We'll talk about the current arts landscape in St. Louis. We'll talk a little bit about race, art, and patterns, and what could be justice. And then I'll open it up for Q&A. I'm going to make it move as quickly as possible because it's still morning for a lot of us. I know if it weren't for this moment, and if I had the opportunity, I would go to sleep. Justice could be defined as the maintenance or administration of what is just by law, or by judicial or other proceedings. Absolutely. And that is how we might use justice on a day-to-day basis. Oftentimes, we use the language of the court of public opinion, do I have a fair trial? This is all kind of like allegorical language where we're trying to use the discourse of law to try to describe something that could be just. But unfortunately, even discourse and law isn't something that's necessarily fair or just. There's precedent. There are certain things that are baked into the system. And I'm speaking more sociologically because that's my background. I'm a sociologist by training. So that means that there are certain patterns, even with our lawmaking, that reflect our culture, right? There's certain things that we do over and over again because of things that we believe to be true, things that we need to believe that we need to have as truth. So that's one definition. Another definition is administering justice based on deserved punishment or reward, which is another idea that comes out of law. But I wanted to use this one partly because of this notion of deserved punishment or reward. Deserved punishment or reward. So when people might be brutalized, assaulted, or something like that, sometimes the people who are doing that, creating that pain, they believe that they are doing something that is just. When you have people who are rewarded for excellence, but again, denied that because of, I don't know, somehow this person doesn't represent who you think should be the recipient of something great, some people might find that to be just. It just depends on your value system. So our values dictate what could be justice. If we don't have the sort of values that allow for people to be able to speak their truth, then whatever sort of reward they receive may never be fully appreciated by the public, partly because of what we think is true. So let's say if we belong to a belief system that says that Caleb can never fully receive the benefit of his brilliance as a poet, partly because he's gay, then anything that happens to Caleb after that is his just desert, his reward, this notion of justice. So justice is a cold instrument. It doesn't really care about how you wield it. It's not what justice is about, not in part. So what is deserved? So we have an arts ecology in St. Louis. A few months ago, a guy by the name of Michael Kaiser, who did some work with the Regional Arts Commission years ago, pointed out a few things. He said the largest arts organizations are larger than their counterparts in similar sized cities. So that means that you'll have a place like the Symphony, you'll have maybe the St. Louis Art Museum or places like that who are outsides, right? They're really huge, comparatively speaking. Whereas if an arts organization in St. Louis may have a $15 million budget, in a similar city somewhere else, that budget might be closer to $5 million. But in St. Louis, the rich get richer, and everybody else get whatever's left, right? And so one of the things he also noticed that we have 47% African Americans in the city of St. Louis, and only one African American arts institution with a budget over $500,000. And that arts organization, that black-led arts organization, is the Black Rep. They've been around for, I think, about 40 years or something like that. Fantastic organization. But the reason why they're only at $500,000, and by the way, for a small nonprofit, which is what we're talking about, nonprofit, black-led arts organizations, to be a small arts organization that's a nonprofit, we're still talking about the $1 million range, $1 million to $5 million range. So the fact that they've yet to crest $1 million speaks to a few different things that are true about St. Louis. But one of the other things they kind of get into, there's a need for addressing many substantial concerns about the current arts ecology, the need for more equity, the need for growth of organizations of color, the need for investment in mid-sized organizations, the need for capacity building, the need for more arts education. All these things are great. And again, this whole notion of equity, meaning that people should be receiving their fair share. But again, we all have different ideas about what's fair. We do. For example, like if an organization is able to raise $1 million, the first thing you might ask about the organization, well, what do they do that was so different from other organizations? Maybe they have a team, maybe they invested in marketing, maybe they invested in development, employees or staffers, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe all those things happen because they merited that sort of grace, that kind of reward, maybe. But I don't know. I don't necessarily think that's 100% true. I use this example. I talk about this guy named Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, he was a separatist, right? You familiar with Marcus Garvey? He was a separatist, but he was also an immigrant from Jamaica. One of the things that he really believed in is that if you Like his favorite person, this guy by the name of Booker T. Washington, if you could just kind of roll up your sleeves, you could go out there and do some work, you could really transform the world, do some great things. And he really focused on empowering the black community. This is in New York. So one of the big ideas that he had was that he wanted to create this thing called the Black Star Line. The Black Star Line was in response to the White Star Line, which was this cruise ship that serviced white people generally, more like affluent white people generally, and he wanted to have that for African Americans or really for people of color. But Marcus Garvey was never able to buy a ship at market value. So that means that he had to put up way too much capital for something that may not float. And so ultimately, this overinvestment in something that would not even leave the harbors of New York meant that he could never really be successful in what he does. The ship would eventually sink. And sometimes that happened, right? So in this case, this whole notion of equity, again, it would be great if people could get their fair share, but the truth of the matter is that there are other forces at play that disrupts this notion of fairness, that disrupts the marketplace, such as racism. It disrupts it. Because if it was strictly about buying something that's of value, regardless of who you are, then you'll get fair market for it. But sometimes in American history, what you had to offer had been devalued based on where you come from, your accent, if you were an immigrant, if you were offspring of enslaved Africans. But the point is, if you were a woman, etc. So if you somehow were devalued, then whatever you had to offer was devalued. And that means you couldn't get value for what you wanted to sell in the marketplace. So Marcus Garvey was denied entry into a fair marketplace, even though we often argue that the market is one of the fairest places we can be, because it's just about selling your goods. Well, what does that mean in terms of our arts context? If I'm a black artist, and I am, if I say that I can teach a group of kids and I want to be paid $500 for the session, and the session might last about an hour or something like that, then the question becomes, do they see me as $500 valued for this particular work? And if they don't, then the question is, well, why don't they? Why can't I be valued at $500? Even if I have a master's degree, even if I have years of experience. Well, sometimes people can't quite put their finger on it, or maybe they don't want to. But what it speaks to is that the moment that you walk into the space, kind of like looking at this piece, this wonderful work of art, you're able to kind of draw your attention to the things that matter to you, the things that you see. And if your body reads as a history that's too complicated for me to embrace, for me to fully reward based on what I think that you have here to offer, if I somehow question the quality of your background because of the high school that you attended or the college that you went to or the experiences that you might have, then that might diminish my place in the market, and then all of a sudden we're back to Marcus Garvey. So it's hard to get at this notion of equity because, again, our value system, I think, are problematic. So back in 1968, there was a group called the Black Artists Group. They started this thing, they started doing artist in residence programs in different schools and things of that nature. This is their old center, it's on Washington. It's just west of Jefferson. They were visual artists, they were poets, they were actors or dramatists, they were musicians. And the reason why they existed is because they had this wonderful person named Catherine Dunham who had relocated to East St. Louis, who was able to divert some of the funding that she received for her work in East St. Louis to support starting up the Black Artists Group. So you have these black St. Louisans who came from schools like Sumner and Vashon, who wanted to do something significant for the community, and they were able to do that. They got an initial investment of about $200,000. I mean, there are arts organizations today that would love just to have $200,000. I mean, so you can imagine if we factor in inflation, what that value really might be today, right? That's serious, serious capital to start this program. And they were doing all kinds of stuff. See, they were influenced by what was happening nationally. It was called the Black Arts Movement that started in New York with Amiri Baraka. And for years, they were offering similar kinds of programs. They weren't able to catch on, unfortunately. They weren't able to find a market for their musicians, for their poets, for their theater work. They couldn't quite do it. So the moment that these major foundations withdrew their funding, and that was the Danforth Foundation, Rockefeller Foundations, they had to close their doors. You would think that $200,000 of seed capital might be able to establish them and they'd be able to keep running from there, keep going from there. But for some reason, they weren't able to catch on in their own city. And they were all from St. Louis. And St. Louis at the time had at least 700,000 people living in the city. So that means there was a much larger population, 400,000 more than what we can enjoy right now. And yet they weren't able to catch on. So when we think about what they were able to do and perhaps why they lost their foundation funding in the first place, which was due to protest and the public critiques of the power structure, it's amazing that they were able to last 4 years, that the funding wasn't withdrawn even sooner. But again, you would think in a fair world, with a fair marketplace, that initial seed capital of $200,000 would make all the difference in the world, but it didn't. So what could justice be? Now look at them, fierce, all of them. Well, what justice could be is that they can be like this, be as fly as they are right here in St. Louis, without fear of assault, without fear of demeaning, without fear of humiliation. They could just be who they are. They don't have to travel to some space like Brave New Voices, which is the name of the competition, in Las Vegas, just to be their dope selves, where people might snicker. But now, of course, they were kind of like the Avengers here. They're all rocking, they came, because they didn't come to play, and they got this like leopard print pattern. You know that something was going on here, and you don't want to mess with a crew that's looking like that. But we know it's not how it goes. Eventually, you kind of break apart. You go your different places, and your distinctive group look becomes very singular in nature. And then you have to deal with and have to shoulder what it means to be who you are, but now back in your home, where they may not know who you really are just yet. And it goes on. So for us, it's understanding, organizationally, it's understanding that this personal does have political implications. It can affect your everyday life. It can affect what kind of funding you can receive. It can affect what kinds of rewards that people will offer you, what you can actually say in public spaces. And so we honor that. Organizationally, I'll say this quickly. Organizationally, we are doing our dinner. And our dinner is latching on to the tradition of the Black Arts Movement and letting people know that if the Black Arts Movement started in 1965 with Amiri Baraka, then we're technically in the second generation of the Black Arts Movement. That looks a lot like what popular music might look like today. I mean, like Lil Nas X. That's a really compelling and interesting story that happened there, right? This guy who was gay, who didn't come out until he had a hit record, which then bought him space. Plus, I think culturally we've kind of moved along a little bit from just a few years ago when we had people like Frank Ocean. But that was just a few years ago. It was like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, right? Bottom line, though, is that he could do this kind of like genre blending of hip-hop and of country, two musical genres that have not been supportive and welcoming to members of the LGBTQ community and was able to have a hit record. To me, that is next generation black arts movement. Because the idea behind the black arts movement is that we no longer have to create art that fits in with the aesthetic taste of the day. We no longer have to somehow contort ourselves so that we align with the powers that be or some of the most influential artists of the time. But instead, we can have our own space. We can be celebrated in our own right and perhaps be able to create a marketplace that makes sense for us. And so that's, I think, where we are. I think we're in a continuation of the black arts movement. Whenever we talk about gains that are happening in the LGBTQ community, when we're talking about the gains that are happening around feminist movements, we're talking about being able to be respected on your own terms without having to conform to somebody else's ideal of what it means to be you. If you want to reach me, this is how I can be reached. The website tells a little bit about who we are. We're always working on the website. But again, I'm MK Stallings. It's been my pleasure to kind of talk to you about these things. And now I want to open it up for any questions that you might have. What's up, Jack?